Well, I had something that I started working on, I think back in 23, um, about Mighty Men of Valor that I would be
Oh
happy
yeah.
to present. It's like a accumulation. It's a particular topic, like Mighty Men of Valor, put God first. And then it's a bunch of verses that would correspond with that. I'd be willing to present that. I've got several different verses and sections prepared. So I'd be more than willing to do a day or two with what I've prepared. I'd be happy to.
Let's do it. I love it. Yeah. We'll wait till you're in Hawaii. All right. We are in Hebrews chapter 12. If you want to make your way there, we're going to actually start in verse 18. So we're shifting. The author of the book is heading towards the end of the book. We've talked about faith. We've talked about increasing faith and encouraging and strengthening others. We talked about the correction that God gives us and the things that He can put in our lives that help our faith to grow. Um, we've talked about a lot of different things. And I just want to remind everyone the main theme that we keep hitting is how God is, or how Jesus is better than the old ways that the Jews had. Because remember, this is to the Hebrews, they have been in this situation where they're facing persecution, and so some have said, "Oh, maybe I'll just go back to the law, and then life will be easier." And this author is pointing out that the law is not better. Jesus is better. And so I'm bringing this up because we keep hitting it. And this week, um, depending on how long it takes us to get through this passage, we are definitely going to hit how Jesus is better. So we're going to talk actually about a contrast between two different things, and the authors specifically is pointing out two different mountains, this mountain, Mount Sinai and Mount Zion, and the differences between these two. And so there's going to be this big contrast, and we're going to look at that. So we're in Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to start by going through verse 18, and I think we're just going to read um, about the first mount, and then we'll go through that. And if we and then we'll go through the second mount and go through that and talk about the contrast. But we'll start with this first part. So it's chapter 12, verse 18 through 21. Um, excuse me. Let's see. Dad, would you mind reading Hebrews 12, 18 through 21?
Sure, John. Okay. For ye have not come to the mountain that may be touched and that burned with fire, and to the blackness and darkness and the tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and the voice of the words, so that those who heard it begged that the words should not be spoken to them any more. For they could not endure what was commanded, and so much as the beast touched the mountain, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. And so terrified was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling.
All right. So again, we're going to contrast two places here, two mountains, and the author is saying we didn't come to this mountain. This is the Old Testament one, and so this whole thing we're going to look at is talking about the difference in the access of God, the difference in the approach, and how we have access to God, and how it's completely different now than it was back then. So he's talking here about this event that happened in Exodus after they leave Egypt. Um, they go to this place where God's going to meet with them and give them the Ten Commandments and tell them some things. So that's what the author is talking about in verse 18 through 21 is this mountain that that the Jews um, had this encounter with God and kind of set the tone for how the rest of their things were going to go until the New Testament, which was really interesting. So let's read some of this because I find this fascinating. It's in Exodus chapter 19. So we're going to jump to Exodus chapter 19. And we're going to start in verse 10. We're going to read a couple of chunks here and there. I'm not going to read through all of it, but just kind of to give us this picture about what's happening when Israel and God meet. And again, like I said, it's fascinating. So is someone up for reading verses 10 through 18? All right, John. Exodus 19, 10 through 18.
19:10 through, I got the reading voice on. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the third day. For the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed yourselves, that ye go not up unto the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall be surely put to death. There shall not an hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through. Whether it be beast or man, it shall not live. When the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. And Moses went down from the mount unto the people, and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said unto the people, Be ready against the third day, come not at your wives. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning, that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceedingly loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at neither part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly.
All right. There's so many interesting things that happen here. I don't, it's hard for me to even know where to start, but we'll attempt to do it. If you see something else that jumps out, we can talk about that too. But there's so many crazy things that are happening. So first of all, we see that God tells the people, go consecrate yourself, and get yourself ready. So here's the deal. God is saying you're gonna have this meeting with him. He's telling the Israelites, we're gonna have this meeting, we're gonna get together, but before we can do it, you have to consecrate yourself. You have to, and consecrate can also be translated as sanctify. They have to make themselves clean, ceremonially clean before they're allowed to meet with God. And there's multiple points here. One of them is that they don't get to come to God on their own terms. They only get to come to him on his terms. And just so it's clear, he brings up there's a lot of things going on that are very scary, right? There's a lot of things where God is coming and the earth is going to shake and there's a fire and God is just consuming the land, and he tells them, don't come to the mountain, don't even touch the mountain, or that person needs to die. And if an animal comes to the mountain, that animal needs to die. It's just this crazy picture. If anyone attempts to approach God, and not anyone, any being, any animal, anything attempts to approach God on their own terms, they're going to die. That's for God's first thing. And then we also see this idea that they have to make themselves clean before they can come and present themselves to the Lord as well. I think that's also this really interesting thing that God says here. You guys got to consecrate yourself. And notice the time frame here, for 3 days. I think that's really interesting too. It's going to be 3 days before they meet God. He gives them a 3-day heads up. And for these first few days, they don't get to approach God. They only get to go to him after the third day. And I like all of this. I like the picture of Jesus here of you can't come to God on your own terms, and only after there was that death and resurrection do we get to come and approach God. So I like all of this here. Um, there's a lot of other interesting things here too. If you look at verse, is it 15? Verse 15, he says, and he said to the people, "Be ready for the third day. Do not come near your wives." And I think this is important because what we read in Hebrews, remember the passage that we read before we got to here was about the difference between pursuing holiness and profaneness. And what we saw last week is profaneness is this giving in to our fleshly desires, seeking out whatever satisfies the flesh, and we're supposed to not do that. That doesn't mean we don't get to enjoy some of those things that God gives us, but it means that's not our first priority. That's not the things. Sometimes we have to abstain from that. Sometimes we have to not go towards that direction, right? We're pursuing holiness, which is different, which means we're supposed to be different. We're not pursuing profaneness, which is what everybody else does. They just, if they feel like doing it, then they do it. So this is really interesting to me that he says that you're not going to go near your wives. And that picture there is about intimacy, right? It's not about, women are terrible, don't go near them. Um, but this whole picture that he sets up is really interesting. Rich, we're in Exodus right now, chapter 19. We're at verses 10 through, I forgot where we read through, 10 through 20. So this whole thing is really interesting, but what's really stands out is it's very, very scary. Everybody is very, very scared. We see also in verse 13, wait, not 13. Let's see. It was that last verse. Verse 18. It says, "Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly." So we see this other aspect. The mountain itself is quaking. And so again, so we're all on the same page. What we're seeing is Israel and God is meeting. God is descending onto the earth on Mount Sinai for them to come. They've had to prepare themselves. They had to consecrate themselves. The mountain is considered holy. Nothing is allowed to touch it. And when he comes, there's thunderings, there's fire, the mountain is quaking. Why do you think the mountain itself is quaking when God comes to Mount Sinai?
Because he wants it to.
Because he wants it to? Why do you think he wants the mountain to quake?
I don't know. He's God. But
I mean, kind of like it's his power, it kind of like impresses you on, what I mean, his power. I mean, lightning, I mean, earthquakes don't happen all the time, right? So when you have the
Yeah.
ground rumbling, a mountain rumbling, whereas, thunder and lightning can happen, right? More often we experience that. So I think it's just all your senses were probably like, wow,
Yeah.
maybe because he doesn't want anything to climb up that mountain. Maybe he wants to keep
Oh,
the animals away from it. And he doesn't want to have to kill anything.
okay.
And what it's an interesting question, John. I think of people running to the crags and caves to be protected from God, and we falsely look at material things for our strength. Well, here's God shaking creation itself, and I think that is an expression of how much greater he is, and as Doug and Dan said.
Yeah.
I definitely think it's show of power. I mean, try to move a mountain, try to push on it and do anything. And here's God shaking the whole thing, just showing like, yeah, look at it, look what I could do.
I think also,
I mean,
oh,
no, go ahead, Mark.
I think also whenever you have royalty enter into anyone's presence, there is a sound, there is an introduction. Now introducing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. His sound, his introduction is a little bit different. He shakes the
Yeah.
entire earth, flashing, et cetera, et cetera. But anytime royalty is introduced, there is a silence, and then there is a announcement of this royalty coming in. This is just a little bit louder than everyone's.
Yeah, yeah. It is an interesting thing that this happens. We know that we're a lot of us live in California, and we know, or if not, all of us have lived in California. One of the things that can happen here is earthquakes, right? And we get little ones, and it's not a big deal, but every once in a while, there's a big one, and we all know that it's potentially possible that we could have a big one which we're not prepared for, which will be devastating because there's just so much power in that earthquake, right? And what we see here is the earth is quaking when God comes to or comes to the earth. And as some of you mentioned, that there is definitely a strength or a show of power that happens. But to me, I just wonder about it. It's just an interesting phenomenon to me. I wonder if this is because of sin and because of the curse, that the earth has been cursed as well. And so the earth also shakes in the presence of God because of the curse of man, because that happened in Genesis 3. I don't know, but I just think that it is really interesting that it happens here. We're going to see a little bit later a picture of heaven, and we don't hear about necessarily earthquakes happening in heaven. And so that's why I just kind of am wondering about this, if it's because of sin, and that somehow the earth is also taking that sin on because of the curse, if it also shakes in the presence of God. It's really interesting.
And the second aspect of that same thought really is also the whole creation awaits and groans for recreation. So the
Yeah,
quaking could
yeah.
be even a excitement.
And
I like that too.
also the innocent animals just run up on the mountain will be killed.
Yeah.
They don't know better. So that's part of creation as well. So I think that, yeah, he holding all creation responsible for the sin.
It is this interesting picture that is happening here. And again, I don't think it's possible to stress how terrifying this must be on some way, right? You're meeting with God. You know that if you get too close to God, you're going to die. And then even the earth is shaking. There's a giant fire. There's thunder, and I'm assuming lightning, and just everything. It's just this crazy picture of how powerful and how great God is, and man gets to meet with God. And to some degree, that's exciting. Man, Israel gets to meet with God, but on some level, on another level, it's very, very scary. It's a it's tenuous because you get to meet with God, but you realize how far we are separated from Him and how dangerous it is to be in His presence. And I think this is a really amazing concept that we don't always catch as Christians because our access has changed. But just how to even say that Jesus is dangerous, some people would probably cringe at that, right? Jesus is dangerous. No, he's meek and mild. He is meek. He's dangerous, though. He has all power and authority. And we even know in the book of Revelation there's going to be a battle with him, and he kills everyone. Everyone, no one is going to survive who resists against him. And it doesn't even take any effort for him to do it. He opens his mouth, and they're all dead. So it's just this crazy picture that we sometimes forget. And so when we hear about the fear of the Lord, sometimes it's good to remember that he is amazingly powerful and he is dangerous.
And what
Uh,
was Moses feeling?
Yeah, yeah. So we'll get to that in a second. Yeah. I'm just going to bring up, I know Pastor Brian brought it up a couple of weeks ago, but I really love in the books of Narnia written by C.S. Lewis, he talks about Aslan is the lion, and they ask one person, this actually happens in multiple books where people will ask, is he a tame lion? Is it safe? And they're like, no, he is not a tame lion. He is a dangerous lion. He is a lion, but he loves you and he can be nice, but he's dangerous. So you can't just go up to him and do whatever you want to do. So I just love this picture here. Any other thoughts before we jump to the next passage here?
Well, verse 18 says, and the mountain shook. It
Yeah,
doesn't say the valleys and the land around it. It says the whole mount quaked greatly. So I'm wondering, I don't know, but I'm wondering if it's just that mountain is shaking. That still, the idea of climbing a mountain that's shaking is really scary. It's extremely, I can't imagine.
yeah, yeah. No, this is crazy. All right. So we read through verse 18. So let's read 19 through 21. Let's see. Tim, would you be up for reading 19 through 21?
Sure. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. Then the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain. And the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through the gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. Did you say 21?
Yeah. So we see this other interesting thing that happens where now they have a kind of a mediator, right? God has appointed Moses. He's the one who goes up to the top of the mountain, not all of Israel. And so there's just an interesting point here where although God is meeting with man, there's even here, there's still a separation where Israel doesn't get to go all the way to the top and be with God. Only Moses gets to do that. And so there's this interesting thing that happens here. And it's just an important note that at this point in time, there is this mediator, and Moses is this mediator. And what we see is they get scared. So actually, this was not actually the passage that I wanted to read, but it's very similar. Let's jump to the next chapter. It's actually chapter 20. Verses 18 through 21. So they go to the mountain, God's giving them the 10 commandments and telling them some things. And let's look at the reaction of the people, what happens here, because this is interesting. But this also goes along with this idea of a mediator. Bill, would you mind reading verses 18 through 21 in chapter 20?
Sure. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning, and the sound of the trumpet and the mountains smoking, the people were afraid and trembled as they stood far off, and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for the Lord has come to test you, and the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was.
Isn't this amazing? So what we read in chapter 19 is God says to Moses, you come here. And then what we read in chapter 20 is the people were so afraid, they said, Moses, you go there. We don't want to go. That's just too scary. We might die if we go. And so there's this interesting thing where Moses, as I mentioned, he becomes the mediator. And it looks like he's actually chosen both by God as the mediator and by the people as the mediator. And he's the one who's going to go in between. He's going to go talk to God. He's going to come back, tell them what God said. And it's just an interesting concept here to me. Again, we have such different access to God that I would be like, I want to go. I want to see what's going on. I want to hear what God has to say. But that apparently it was so scary that they're like, no, I do not want to go hear what God has to say. I want to hear what he has to say, but I want to do it from a distance. So Moses, you go find out what he has to say and come back and tell me. And I think this is very, very interesting.
But I think it's all true, but this passage always struck me how the people were before God in their response to God, not so
Yeah.
much as fear, but in my opinion, my take is, yes, it's fear, but there's rejection here.
Mm.
This is the beginning of the mob mentality. And I get a sense these people feel safety in numbers and they're afraid to go out alone before God.
Yeah.
And somehow, not the rocks will not keep them safe, but the people, they think, being in a crowd of people, think they would. I'm hidden here, not exposed, if you know what I mean. That's the sense I get with this response. And it manifests later as they're killing saying crucify Jesus. I think it's the same kind of mob mentality. I don't look at it positively in almost any way, shape, or form. With this initial rejection, I call it rejection.
Rebellion.
Yeah.
I would agree with you, because the whole idea of saying, I don't want to be close to God, I want you to do it for me, that's not the way God wants it to be, right? He doesn't
Yes.
want a relationship through proxy with us. He wants a relationship with us, and we should want that relationship with him too. And you're right. That's how I always see this, as Israel going, I kind of want the relationship, but it might cost too much. It might be too much. I'm going to ask this person to do it for me. Yeah, I agree. Okay.
Next time I'm at a lecture, I should sit up front instead of in the back. There you go, Doug.
You gotta be in the splash zone.
I like
All
the
right.
back row.
And to some degree that is true when you're in the back row, right? It's the idea that I'm kind of hidden. The person's not going to really see me. I'm back there, so I'm kind of safe. So I can participate without having to put what's the word? Skin in the game. I don't have to put myself out there, and it's kind of a safe position. And that's how school is too, right? People will sit in the back so they can, they can listen when they want to, but they can also do their own thing when they want to. So yeah, it's a good point.
That's not the only reason to sit in the back in a crowd. It also is
Sure.
from a safety aspect, is there's no one behind you. So the fight flight response is minimal, and you can exit quickly. You can also survey what's going on. And if any threats come in, you can immediately remove yourself or neutralize that threat from the back.
And then there's the middle.
You're kind of right, except in most churches, the entrance is at the back so that you can't see the person coming in. So you would have to be at the door in order to be in that position.
That's true. That is true. But the people yes, that is true.
But the enemy lurks in the shadows for those that trail to be picked off in the back. Sorry.
That's good. So let's read verse 22 through 25. Again, this is fascinating to me. Eric, do you mind reading verses 22 through 25? We're in chapter 20 now.
Oh, yeah. Then the Lord said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You shall not make other gods besides me, gods of silver or gods of gold. You shall not make for yourselves. No, you shall not make for yourselves. You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings and your sheep and your oxen in every place where I cause my name to be remembered. I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it of cut stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it, and you shall not go up by steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed.
All right. So God's
was good
he's
reading.
he's met with them, he's given them the commandments, he said these things, but then also we notice this one other aspect here where he's still saying to them, you don't get to approach God on your own terms. You don't get to do it. You don't get to make your own idols and act like that's how you're going to approach through them. And then I find this really interesting. When you make an altar, and he's saying, make an altar, do that and present your offerings, but don't mess with the stone. Don't make your own stone. Don't make it in your own shapes. It's only allowed to be used if God is the creator of those stones. If man messes with the stones, it's profane. And I think that's kind of hilarious that God is saying, if you try to go and make my stones better and make the shape to your liking, you've messed it up.
I love
And
that.
so,
That jumped out at me as well. You know, the stones find the way I made it. All right, use it the way it was. Don't wreck it. I love it.
yeah. And there is a great point here, which is, again, and I brought this up multiple times now, we don't get to approach God on our terms. We don't get to approach him in the way that we want to. We only get to do it in the way that he allows us to do it. And it's interesting. Verse 23 that Eric read, mine says it a little bit differently, and I'm pretty sure it means the same thing, but it's just a little different. It says, you shall not make anything to be with me. Gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves. And I like that phrase. You shall not make anything to be with me. You don't get to make anything that makes it easy for you to be with the Lord, because that's not how it works, right? You
And
don't get to
how
make
does,
things that are easier.
And how does that contrast to the cathedrals in Europe?
Yeah. I mean, man breaks this all the time, right? Because in various different ways, if we think we can do something that makes it easier for for us to approach God, then we have broken what he's telling us in this passage right here. You don't get to do it. You only get to approach him in the way that he allows us to approach him. Now, things are different. We have Jesus. We're going to see when we get into the next mount, this contrast of how different everything is. But at this point in time with the Jews, this is how they could approach God. They could only approach, notice there's a few things that we want to keep track of here. One, that God descends to earth for man and God to meet. So that's an important aspect to realize here, that God's the one who comes down to here. The second is it's very, very dangerous to go into the presence of God. You could die. I mean, just from reading all of the things that we read, we even skip some parts where God warns them, don't approach me, or don't even look at me too strong, or you could die. So it's dangerous. The third thing is they have to consecrate themselves for 3 days before they get to approach the Lord. And then all of these other tools that we might have in our worship of God and the way we do it, again, we don't get to make up how we do it. We have to follow the way the Lord tells us to do it. So they had access to God, but uh it was a scary prospect. It was different. It was interesting, the way that they could do it. And it was so scary. Oh, and I missed the one other important part, which they needed a mediator. It was so scary that they had somebody who was in between them and God, and they were listening to God through this person and talking to God through this person, which is also very interesting. Go ahead, Eric.
My apologies. Sorry, my mind it skipping over a few other things here. But when did the fear is recognition of being sinners as well. But when did the practice of avoiding the use of God's name in fear of accidentally blaspheming him come into practice with the Jews?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I
It'll
mean,
help.
up until this point in Exodus, they didn't even really have a name for him.
Yeah.
So it had to be after this. I don't
And it
know.
wasn't a command, and it wasn't You know, they were just afraid this is the way I'll avoid sin, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, I just see the reflection of this kind of behavior through most all the Bible, right? I mean, human
Yeah.
behavior. So thanks.
You know, just one thing on that aspect of building that altar, you know, I was thinking about is like, you know, we can't, you know, it's a big thing with Jesus, right? We know it's grace and mercy, right? But man just has this works kind of mentality. And I think it makes, to me, I feel like it's like God, you know, hey, you know, your works are nothing. You know what I mean? They're worthless, just like our filthy rags and how we are. You know, it's all Him, grace and mercy, what He does for us, and we need to honor Him, right? We need to, you know,
Yeah.
worship Him and praise Him always, and that's, you know. But I get that whole temple thing. I mean, and then you get to the whole tabernacle, and then you go, well, wait a minute, we did that, you know, but it was all based on His direction. So sorry, kind of random.
No, if you bring up an interesting point too, which is what God even tells them is you don't even get to make stairs up to the altar, because if your nakedness accidentally flashes that altar, you've just profaned it. Just our display of our body on the altar, boom, you've profaned it. And there's just this huge picture of how really man is the problem here. Man is going to profane any or mess up our worship of God. If we do anything that is in our own strength or even just in our visibility, right, we've messed it up.
You know, what's interesting is you bring that up, I think towards David and Solomon. I mean, oh, well, David in this case, he had the right heart and said, God, you know, we have a house here, you don't have a house. And of course we know the whole story, but and he builds, you know, Solomon built one of the most beautiful things the world's ever seen.
Yeah.
And I think it's with the right heart, honestly, because otherwise I don't think God would have honored that. So there's a component in which we can do things around the worship of God in some sense that displays our heart's desire to honor him. But yet at the same time, what's really interesting is, you know, that temple became this symbol probably beyond what it intended. But people wanted it for its beauty. People want, I mean, it's nothing, after a while, it had nothing to do with the presence of God. It got destroyed, and God wanted to, you know, allowed it to be destroyed because the people idolized probably the temple more so than the presence of God itself.
Yep.
So much so that when Zerubbabel came around and he built the second one, they were like, this thing's a piece of junk.
Yep.
You know, relative to the first one, without realizing it's actually the same in the sense that God was going to be in the midst of it, but they lost sight of that. So it's really interesting just to kind of think through that whole thing. There's a component, though, I think, where it's worth mentioning when the heart is right and you give this offering to God, it can be definitely God glorifying, but yet that piece can also even become a stumbling block.
Yeah.
If the glory of it, you know, because that was obviously built by the wisest man on earth, and it must have exceeded anything and everything at the time and probably still today, even architecturally, it can be stained. You know, people's hearts that get drawn to something far different than the actual substance of what that place is supposed to be, which is this is where God is, and this is where the approach to God, you know, is defined. And he didn't change that, obviously. I mean, the Holy of Holies still stood as plainly as it did because God said, but it's pretty cool to kind of think through all that.
Yeah. And it's also I love what you're saying, because it does have to take the right heart, and at the same time, even with the right heart, God can still say, nope, that's not going to work. And that's what happened with David, right? He's got the heart to do it, and God's like, nope, can't do it, David. Your son can do it. You can't do it. Yeah. There's something forming right there with Eric. I could tell.
No,
It's not quite out.
I gotta stop. As Doug had said earlier in the week, sometimes we come with our minds not quite running, but our tongue is. So that's this morning.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Slow it down.
Well, I'm debating on if we should start the next mountain because we only have 10 minutes left. but there's this compare and contrast between this mountain and the next mountain. And some of the things that the author brings up that contrast, I'm like, huh, I never even considered that. I never thought about that. So I guess we can start and then we'll have to finish it next week. So let's jump back to Hebrews chapter 12.
That was quick.
Oh, not Habakkuk.
Time flies when you're talking God, guys.
I
It's funny.
know. All right, so we're gonna read the passage that talks about this other mountain. So we talked about Mount Sinai, which is that experience we just read about, and now we're going to talk about Mount Zion and the New Jerusalem. So let's see where we are, or where are we at? Chapter 12, verse 22, and I'll just read that here. It says, so let me just read verse 18, just the first part of it, just so kind of we can see this contrast here. It says, for you have not come to the mountain that may be touched and that's burnt with fire. And then let's move to verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of the sprinkling that speaks better than that of Abel. So we see this gigantic contrast between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion here. There's a lot of stuff, more than we'll cover in the 10 minutes. But we can see that here. This is pretty cool. So we'll just start off with the very first point here, which is just incredible, which is that where we don't have access to God through Mount Sinai, we have access to God through Mount Zion. And there's a big difference here because Mount Sinai is where God descended to the earth to meet with man. Mount Zion is the picture, is where God dwells, and man is invited to come to the dwelling place of God. So two completely different points of view, right? Instead of God descending to man, it is God ascending man to heaven with him. It's just this beautiful, completely different perspective. And that in itself, if the author ended there, I'd be like, yeah, I totally get it. God's inviting us to be with him. It's so much better than what we saw in Exodus. That isn't where the author stops, but it's just an important point. Again, the point the author is making is that because of Jesus, our access to God is better. Remember the whole point of this book, Jesus is better. The Mosaic Law does not give us better access to God. Jesus gives us this better access to him. All right. So if you look in verse 22, you'll see something interesting here. It says, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God. And notice the difference here between Mount Zion and Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is this desolate place. It's burned up and consumed. It's on fire and it's shaking. And here in Mount Zion, it's described as a city. And the idea here of it being a city is it's full of life. There's lots of other things that are going on. In fact, the author is going to list some of those things that are in this Mount Zion, in the city of the living God. It's a city. It's bustling and full of activity. There's lots of things going on. Again, just a big contrast between these two mountains. That not only is this where God dwells, but where he dwells, there's things going on. You know, he's not just alone by himself. There's not this picture that some people have of God residing on a cloud in the middle of the sky somewhere far away. He's in a city. There's a lot going on. And this is kind of something that I never really considered or thought about, was how you might describe the dwelling place of God as a city. But this is what it's described as. It's the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. And then check out this next part, to an innumerable company of angels. So not only is this a city? But there's a lot of beings who live there. A lot of them aren't human, right? They're not descendants of Adam. They are angels. Why do you think that we're told here that there is this innumerable company of angels? He could have just said angels. Why do you think it's important for us to know that there's an innumerable number of them?
Portrays it as a heavenly place.
It's
Okay.
huge.
I think that's a
So-
big one, right? It's big.
Mhm.
If I understand what you're saying, or John, I'm getting a sense this is expressing a physical place. To me, my reaction to these passages is it is a spiritual place,
Okay.
non-physical, and thus, there's no place
Yeah.
anymore. So I mean, it's just my thoughts, and it's where I
Yeah.
am on the notion of temple at
So-
this juncture.
Let me clarify, because I'm not sure how to answer that question exactly. Let me say it this way. It is a real place. It is reality. I saying it's spiritual or physical at this point in time, what does it mean to even be spiritual? Does that mean it's physically, but it's in a different dimension? I don't know how to reconcile these two things because I don't know
Well-
enough about the spiritual realm.
Understood. But heavenly Jerusalem, to me, I
Yeah.
interpret as this is the kingdom of heaven,
Yep.
and it is not about a physical place. To be more explicit about what I am,
What
where
do
I
you mean
stand,
by it's
where
not a physical place? You mean it has no
Oh,
physicality, or that it's not a real place, or
I don't know what
I'm not
real
sure.
is when you're talking heaven, right? As you
That's-
kind of say, right? But
Yeah.
this, you have come to it, and it is a heavenly Jerusalem.
Well,
Is my
when I
take.
get there, it's gonna be real to me.
Pardon?
Yeah.
When
No,
I
I'm
get
thinking here
there,
and now, because he's saying you
Yeah, yeah.
have come to
it's
it.
gonna be real
Yeah.
to me.
But I mean, I see your point, Eric. I mean, I always think of when you are talking heavenly and everything. I mean, God's, he's in this, he's outside of time. Yeah. What is eternal like? You know what I mean? So it's already outside of our capacity of what we feel, I
Yeah.
mean, it's amazing, right? It really is. I mean, and that's as a curious person, right? It'll be amazing to experience, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
But
gonna be,
And
I think-
also to be a little, to reiterate really that I'm not talking about a future time or when we're in heaven. I'm talking about here and
but
now.
now. Yeah.
And-
And that's important. Yeah, go ahead. I'm excited, so I'm interrupting you. I apologize.
Yeah, I mean, the woman at the well, there'll come a time when you will not be worshiping at the place. And my reaction to that and my general interpretation is, well, this is the expression of that. It is the body of Christ is not a place. It's those who have the Holy Spirit abiding in them and connected as one body with one head. To me, this is an expression of that. That is the heavenly Jerusalem, or the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
And of course, it's parallel to a future, in heaven, or heaven on earth, as you want, however you want to express it. I am not. I feel like we do limit things when we try to combine them into a physical structure, or even envision a physical structure, and go back. To me, it's almost like falling back to the law, which is what
Okay.
we're discussing at the core here. Those things are actually obsolete, and so is the notion of a temple. So I'm saying a little tersely, simply to clarify, and I'm not what's the word? What is dogmatic per se? I'm all ears, but it has been my response to this notion.
So let me just respond. We only have 3 minutes, so I don't know if I can get through all this in 3 minutes. But let me just respond, because I agree with what you're saying, but there is there's also a little bit of a danger with it. So let me respond, which is absolutely
Fear not.
the future. In the future, there will be this merging of the Jerusalem and earth. There will be a new heaven, a new earth, and New Jerusalem will descend on heaven, and it will be a different type of thing. And we could say that's physical, probably, because it's still attached with earth, and there's this 1,000 period reign and all of that stuff. So definitely there is this futuristic aspect of it, but you are correct in saying that this is now. This is now, and this is a real place, but it's not a physical place. It's in a spiritual kingdom. The danger, though, with saying that is when you spiritualize things, sometimes people can say, well, that is abstract and that is far removed from where I am. So I don't really consider it reality. It doesn't match with what I know of reality. So it's not relevant. Right. And so that's the only point that I would make. I think you're
Yeah,
totally right.
you've
It's a
actually
real
pressed the
place.
button. That response to me is we don't speak in fear of how others might interpret it.
Sure.
You know, I
Okay.
think address it for what it is. I mean, sure,
Yeah.
there's danger of going off spiritually. There's danger of going off literally. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think that helps. We you press into the point, and
Yeah.
okay, who spiritualized things? Jesus, the Holy Spirit. You know, we are afraid
Yeah.
of our wild imaginations, but we know that if we see how others might misinterpret it, they're going to misinterpret the truth wherever we find it.
Yeah.
So there's a danger that's the button you pressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're
And you're
leaning
right.
into the word. Yeah.
And I'm not worried about the danger. I'm just clarifying that yes, it is a spiritual place, but it is still relevant to what we're talking about. It's
Fair.
still
Yes.
relevant to us because it is still a real place. It's still
Mhm.
reality. It's just a place we don't quite understand because it's not in the realm that we can experience,
I mean,
at least in a
I'm
physical
all
way.
with you. Yeah. All in.
our
Yeah.
time is up, but I'll drop this just for consideration.
Yeah.
I think about Daniel praying, and then the angel comes and says, your prayer has been heard. We've been warring for what, 21 days? I don't remember what it was. So there's this
Yeah.
cosmic thing going on in which I don't know how Daniel's prayers would interact. I mean, the way I picture it, and I don't know that it's fully accurate. It just says God heard your prayers, but that somehow that prayer interacts with a kingdom in which we do not
Yeah.
see. And so the reality of the experience on earth, obviously, it's just, I'm on my knees doing whatever that I'm doing. But there's a reality of something happening. And I don't think that was just figurative language. I think, me fighting the Prince of
Yeah.
Persia seems to be very literal language of something happening in the heavenlies, that there is something there. Obviously, I don't think you're saying, Eric, that there is no spiritual kingdom. Obviously there is. We just don't know.
Yeah.
It's just interesting the way I think about Daniel's prayer impacting that without understanding how it exactly does, because how that relates perhaps to this passage. And again, we don't know. I don't know, at least. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
And physical may be a subdomain of spiritual. So saying it's spiritual and not physical might not be accurate. It might be that spiritual includes physical. I don't know the answer to all of this, but I'm just clarifying that it doesn't mean it's not physical. It just means that it's not physical in a way that we understand physical. It could be, like I mentioned earlier, I like math. I like dimensionality of things. It could be it's four-dimensional and it's still physical, but it's in a dimension that we just don't have access to. And although they do have access to our dimension. So that's why I'm saying physicality, from what we understand, might be a subdomain of the spirituality of things. And so I don't know if I would want to classify it as not physical, but
Yeah, so
that's just
understood.
me.
My take was very trying to be short, and I think that we have a lot more agreement than I might have set up here. But to be continued, because this is not a light issue in Hebrews here. in this particular.
Yeah,
section.
and we haven't finished it, so we'll go through it
Right.
next week.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody up for praying for us? We'll close it out.
Sure.
All right, John. We got